This Easter season, the church has us rest in the letter of Peter. And again, I've tried to keep before us that line from his of always be ready to give a reason, an explanation to anyone who asks, a reason for your hope, but do it with gentleness and do it with reverence. How do we find hope in our own witness and our own story? 2 weeks ago, it was that whole teaching. He used that language of this burning away, like hardships and trials. They like burn away the impurities. He used that analogy with metal. The impurities are burned away. Sure, that's part of our own story. Last week it was that analogy or that teaching about, just remember you're on a sojourn, you're on a journey. And that Greek word there, parakois, which is translated to perish. Like, this is not our home. Like, if you're going to give a reason for your hope, can you hold both of those together? This sense of hardships and trials and uncertainties, they kind of purify, and yet they keep reminding us of our eternal. And today speaks of Jesus, the example of Christ, that we might follow in his footsteps. Not admire, not appreciate, not believe in, but we're called to follow. And watch this opening line. If you are patient, when you suffer for doing what is good, it's a grace before God. And then you've been called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his footsteps. We're called not to admire, not to appreciate, not even so much to believe in. We're called to follow. And our suffering, our hardships, our trials provide a tremendous pathway into such following. Again, we're called to follow. If you're patient for doing what is good, this is a grace before God. For Christ also suffered for you, leaving you as an example that you might follow in his footsteps. How do we address and respond and embrace the question of suffering, of hardships, of trials, of the unexpected events of life that sometimes come in so unannounced? Like, how do we offer hope? Like, what's the reason for your hope? Perhaps we've walked with people or are aware of our own story in that sense. At times when suffering and hardship and trials come to us, sometimes, if we're not careful, it can leave our heart a little bitter, a little resentful, a little closed. Then we separate ourselves from God and separate ourselves from others. Simultaneously, perhaps you've walked with and others who have embraced such hardship and trial and suffering in their life, and their heart becomes more tender, more gentle, more loving. They love God more, they love people more. So it's not so much the suffering, the hardship, or the trial, it's the response. And how do we enter into that? I know for myself, when I go back several months when I sat before the bishop and he gave me that news of this transfer, I left shocked. I left stunned. I couldn't even think. I woke up the next morning and thought, did this really happen? Was that a dream? And so how do you enter into it? With the eyes of faith. How do you enter into the sorrow, Randy? And how do the scriptures comfort you? One thing I know is this: in the midst of such, when the rug is pulled out, two things you can be assured of. Number one, we are more needy than we realize. Like when we are so helpless, we become so aware how needy we are. And the second thing that happens, just as clearly, is we are more fully alive. We see what is of highest priority and of most importance so clearly. So as we enter into this reason for your hope with this sense of this desire to follow Christ in his footsteps, perhaps 5 pathways that have been helpful for me. One is that pathway just of weeping, of crying out, of staying in relationship with God, and almost feeling that cry of the psalmist, like darkness just surrounds me. And yet, that invitation, the Lord is my shepherd. Right, in the midst of such helplessness, I began to realize my helplessness, our helplessness, is more valuable to God than our holiness. Cry out from your weeping and your helplessness and make that a prayer. But don't separate yourself from God. And don't think you're going to understand this, Randy. The second piece is all about trust. It's about trust. Imagine yourself in the first century. You've heard of Jesus. You've admired Jesus. You've watched him perform these miracles. You watch the crowd swell around him. And there you find yourself at the foot of Calvary. And you're looking at him being crucified. And you're asking yourself, is there anything good that can possibly come of this? Is there anything good? There's the invitation. Will you flee? Will you trust? Another piece is prayer. How did Jesus pray? Not my will, but your will be done. Not my kingdom, your kingdom. Father, if it's possible, take this cup of suffering from me, yet not my will, but your will be done. Lead me where you need me is a good prayer. Another piece, there's something about trial and hardship and suffering that reorders our lives, isn't there? Like when life just brings that gut punch right into you, all of a sudden, all of those appetites, all those pleasures, all those things that you seek comfort in, they just wash away. It's about people. It's about relationships. It's about one-on-one with the person who's before me. It's about reordering our loves. I also can't help but think, recently, once again, our parish Deacon David and others were down in Belize. They just recently came back, and as I listened with people and their stories, the first thing they talked about, the children, the people were so content. They were so happy. They had absolutely nothing, but they were so joy-filled. There's something so beautiful and attractive when everything else is stripped away that just brings joy to others. And then the last piece is all about hope. And I love how St. Paul instructs us, how St. Paul reminds us. He says, I reckon, like I consider, I think, I am convinced, I'm solidly convinced that the sufferings of the present time will be nothing compared to the eternal glory. So when you find yourself in that place of great hardship and trial and setbacks and suffering, don't focus upon yourself. Focus upon the promise of the eternal glory. The eternal glory, Randy. The eternal glory. No more tears, no more sorrow, no more suffering, no more setbacks, no more chemo, no more cancer, no more wheelchairs. Eternal glory. Might we, as followers, we're called not to admire, not to appreciate, not to believe in even. We're called to follow in his footsteps. And like St. Peter, always be ready to give an explanation for the reason for your hope, but do it with gentleness and do it with reverence.